Botswana, one of Africa's last great wildlife sanctuaries, is often called the land of giants. Home to over 130,000 elephants, the country harbors the largest remaining population of the species, standing as a global symbol of conservation and biodiversity. However, in 2020, this paradise faced a tragedy that would shake not only the region but also the world. Early that year, something unusual began happening in a remote area of the Okavango Delta. Rangers reported sightings of multiple elephant carcasses scattered across the landscape. Initially, these were a few isolated cases, but within weeks, the number skyrocketed, exceeding 350 deaths in just 3 months. The scene was haunting. Lifeless bodies of adult and young elephants lay on the dry ground, while life continued around them as if nothing had happened. The mystery went beyond the sheer number of deaths. The elephants' tusks were intact, immediately ruling out poaching. Initial tests for known diseases like anthrax also came back negative. There were no visible injuries or trauma, and the bodies showed no clear signs of malnutrition or infection. Scientists and authorities were baffled. Meanwhile, the tragedy began to draw international attention. Environmentalists warned of the catastrophic ecological impact if the cause was not discovered quickly. Elephants are considered a keystone species, playing a crucial role in maintaining local biodiversity. Each life lost was a blow to the delicate balance of the region. With no immediate answers, the pressure mounted. The Botswana government, in partnership with international institutions, launched a large-scale investigation. Veterinarians, scientists, and wildlife experts joined forces to solve the enigma. However, with few concrete leads, anxiety grew. What could be causing so many deaths in such a robust and adaptable species? As these questions remained unanswered, the tragedy continued to unfold, leaving a trail of uncertainty and driving scientists to seek new ways to understand what was happening. As weeks passed and more carcasses were found, the investigative team began mapping patterns. The location of the bodies, seemingly random at first glance, revealed something intriguing. Almost all the dead elephants were near water sources. This initial discovery directed efforts to understand the crucial role of these natural resources in the mystery. Using satellite imagery, scientists analyzed over 3,000 water sources in the region. This technology allowed them to observe seasonal changes, identify critical areas, and compare the conditions in 2020 with previous years. As the data was analyzed, a solid lead emerged. Some of these water sources showed visible changes in color and consistency, typical indicators of algal blooms. The use of satellites not only saved time, but also expanded the scope of research. On the ground, water samples were collected from dozens of sites, while drones flew over inaccessible areas to capture detailed images. Experts began to notice that something unusual was occurring. Many of the water points analyzed had high nutrient concentrations, creating a perfect environment for microorganism proliferation. As evidence mounted, initial hypotheses of diseases or poisoning from human activities were ruled out. There were no traces of pesticides, heavy metals, or other chemical elements commonly associated with mass intoxication events. Attention then shifted to the microorganisms present in the waters. The discovery of a clearer pattern made scientists cautiously optimistic. However, it was still necessary to prove that these organisms posed a lethal threat to elephants. Detailed studies were conducted in laboratories using the collected samples. Meanwhile, in the region, monitoring efforts intensified. Rangers began observing the behavior of surviving elephants. Some animals avoided certain areas, while others continued to frequent suspicious water points. Tension grew. Was the scientific team close to finding an answer? The scientists finally reached a crucial point in the investigation. What seemed like an invisible problem was taking shape before their eyes. After meticulous analyses of the collected samples, the cause began to emerge. The examined water sources contained an unusual concentration of cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae. These bacteria, although common in aquatic environments, can become lethal under certain conditions. During bloom events, when they grow rapidly due to excess nutrients and heat, they release potent toxins that affect animals' nervous systems and vital organs. For elephants, who depend on these water sources for survival, these toxins became a deadly trap. Studies revealed that elephants consuming the contaminated water initially displayed subtle symptoms: dizziness, weakness, and motor difficulties. As migratory animals capable of traveling great distances daily, many walked up to 16.5 kilometers after ingesting the poison before succumbing. The average time between exposure and death was estimated at around 88 hours, making it even harder to trace the problem's exact origin early in the investigation. Spatial analysis confirmed the direct link between the discovered carcasses and water sources with high cyanobacteria levels. Satellite imagery showed that in 2020, the proliferation of these algae was significantly greater than in previous years. Something extraordinary was happening during that period, and the data indicated that environmental conditions played a central role in the disaster. What made the 2020 event unique was not just the presence of algae, but the alarming biomass levels generated. The analyzed water sources showed extreme cyanobacteria colony growth, creating a highly toxic environment. For the first time, the team of scientists had a concrete answer to the mystery. However, this discovery raised a new question. What exactly caused this explosive growth of toxic algae in 2020? The connection between the event and environmental changes was undeniable, but deeper causes still needed explanation. The tragedy that devastated the elephant population in 2020 was more than an isolated event. Scientists were now facing a troubling reality. Climate change had created the perfect conditions for the disaster. Data collected revealed an extreme climatic pattern in preceding years. In 2019, the region experienced one of the most severe droughts of the decade. Rivers dried up, lakes shrank, and vegetation became scarce, forcing elephants to travel long distances in search of water. However, in 2020, the scenario changed drastically. Heavy rains inundated areas, bringing accumulated nutrients to water sources. This alternation of extremes, severe drought followed by intense rainfall, has become an increasingly common feature in southern Africa, a region highly vulnerable to global warming. The excess nutrients brought by the rains created the ideal environment for cyanobacteria proliferation. Combined with higher temperatures recorded that year, conditions for algal blooms were amplified. Scientists explain that climate change not only alters temperature and precipitation patterns, but also directly impacts water quality. Reservoirs that once sustained wildlife were now becoming death traps. The forecast was grim. With advancing global warming, extreme events like 2020 could become more frequent and intense, affecting elephants and other species relying on the same water sources. In addition, the declining availability of clean and safe water during drier months posed an increasing threat. Many water bodies in the region were disappearing or becoming permanently polluted, limiting options for animals. Scientists warned that without global action to curb warming, Botswana's vulnerable ecosystems could face even greater crises in the future. The discovery that climate change was a catalyst for the 2020 event brought new urgency to the issue. It was not just a local tragedy. It was a global warning about the impacts of environmental imbalance. The discovery of the cause of the mass elephant deaths brought not only answers, but also an urgent responsibility to prevent similar tragedies. Scientists, environmentalists, and Botswana authorities united to devise strategies to mitigate climate change impacts on local ecosystems and protect wildlife. The first step was enhancing water source monitoring. Using satellite imagery and remote sensing technologies, authorities established a continuous surveillance system to identify and predict algal bloom events. Modern equipment was installed at strategic locations to measure water quality in real time. This approach enabled quicker interventions, such as temporarily restricting access to contaminated sources. Efforts toward environmental restoration were also implemented, Replanting trees and preserving wetlands near water sources helped regulate nutrient flow and reduce ideal conditions for cyanobacteria proliferation. Specialists worked to educate local communities on sustainable management practices to minimize human impact on water resources. However, it became clear that the ultimate solution required global action. Like other African countries, Botswana was on the front lines of climate change impacts, but bore little responsibility for global carbon emissions. The elephant tragedy was a painful reminder that the effects of global warming cross borders, impacting the most vulnerable and biodiverse ecosystems. International organizations, moved by the impact of the 2020 event, began supporting conservation projects in Botswana. Funding was directed toward research, infrastructure, and environmental education, ensuring the tragedy was not forgotten and that critical lessons were applied. In the end, the 2020 elephant tragedy became a symbol of the need for collective action. It not only highlighted the interconnectedness of climatic phenomena and ecosystems, but also served as a global warning against neglecting the signs of warming. Today, the waters of the Okavango Delta continue to sustain wildlife, but are now monitored with heightened vigilance. The memory of the lost elephants remains a reminder that protecting the environment is a shared responsibility, and that the survival of Botswana's giants depends on choices made worldwide.